My name is Hannah Miller, and 3 years before I stood on a stage accepting a James Beard Award, my mother sent a text that made my chest go cold. It was meant for my siblings. But she didn't bother to remove my name from the group chat before she hit send. The message read, "Hannah is officially wasting her life on this grease trap hobby. We need to stop pretending it's a business before she embarrasses us." I can't even tell the club board what she's doing. 3 seconds later, the typing indicator bubbled. It was my brother, Preston, a corporate real estate attorney. His reply was swift. "Agreed, it's a blue-collar phase. Give it 6 months and she'll be asking for a bailout." I was standing in a rented commissary kitchen on the industrial edge of Birmingham, Alabama, when I read those words. I was 31 years old. The fluorescent lights overhead hummed a low, persistent note that settled right at the base of my skull. My hands smelled of smoked pork shoulder and chemical bleach. My checking account held exactly $412, the remainder of my life savings, after I'd handed a cash envelope to a local mechanic to rebuild the transmission of a rusted step van. I read the messages twice. I didn't type out a frantic defense of the 70-hour workweeks I just survived. I didn't shed a single tear over the glass surface of my phone. I wiped my hands on my apron, set the phone face down on the stainless steel prep table, picked up my 8-inch chef's knife, and went back to dicing onions. Welcome back to Aura Vengeance. If you've ever had your life passion reduced to a phase by people who measure human worth by zip codes and country club memberships, this story is going to feel familiar. Drop a comment with your age and the word "served" if you've ever used your own family doubting you as fuel to build an empire. And please subscribe. Because what happened at the James Beard Award Gala 3 years later is a lesson my mother is still trying to explain to her friends. Fast forward to a Tuesday night in Chicago. I was standing in a grand ballroom, adjusting the silk strap of my evening gown. I caught her eye across the room. My mother was sitting 30 feet away at a sponsor table, paid for by my brother and his law firm. She was wearing a tailored Chanel blazer. The room was a sea of clinking crystal and polite applause. The air carried the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfume. When our gazes met across the dim room, my mother leaned forward, pressed both hands to her chest, and mouthed 3 words to me, "That is my daughter." She was staring at the gold medal suspended around my neck. The ribbon dug slightly into my collarbone. I looked down at the brass disc. The name engraved on the back was mine. But it wasn't the identity she gave me. It was the name I had forged for myself. To understand why I didn't smile back and why I didn't stop at her table to embrace her for the flashes of the culinary press, you have to understand what it took to get out of that kitchen in Birmingham. You have to understand what my family did when I asked for what was already mine. 2 weeks before I opened the serving window for the first time, I hit a financial wall. The rebuilt transmission had drained my operating capital. I had the city permits, the fresh ingredients, the menu. What I didn't have was a power source. A commercial-grade food truck requires a heavy-duty diesel generator to run 2 refrigerators, a flat-top grill, and a deep fryer simultaneously. The specific model I needed to handle the load cost exactly $8,500. Without it, my truck was just a useless metal box baking in the Alabama sun. I had one avenue left. My grandfather had passed away 5 years prior, leaving behind a modest trust fund specifically designated for the business endeavors of his grandchildren. My brother Preston had used his share to pay for his bar exam prep courses and the security deposit on his first luxury apartment. My sister Caroline tapped into her portion to launch a boutique real estate marketing firm that lasted 8 months before she grew bored and abandoned it. The trust was managed entirely by my mother, Patricia. She held the checkbook. I spent 3 nights awake at my kitchen table drafting a 20-page business plan. I included projected food costs, labor margins, foot traffic analysis, and equipment depreciation schedules. I printed the document on heavy stock paper and bound it in a dark leather portfolio. I asked my mother to meet me at a cafe in Mountain Brook, the kind of establishment that served $12 lattes and featured crushed velvet seating. She arrived 10 minutes late, wearing a crisp tennis skirt and pearl earrings. She sat down across from me and ordered sparkling water with a twist of lime. I slid the leather portfolio across the marble table, keeping my voice steady. I told her I was 2 weeks away from launch and needed the designated trust funds to purchase the generator. Patricia didn't open the binder. She didn't even glance at the table of contents. She placed one manicured finger on the leather cover and pushed it slowly back across the marble surface until it hit my coffee cup. "We are not releasing the funds, Hannah," she said, her voice kept at a low. Polite volume so the adjacent tables wouldn't overhear. A food truck is a downward spiral. It is not a career. It is a cry for attention. We will not finance your downward mobility. To understand the exact flavor of my mother's cruelty, you have to understand the architecture of her terror. Patricia is a woman built entirely on the fear of sliding backward. 30 years ago, her own father ran a working-class diner on the edge of town, serving meatloaf and black coffee to factory workers. I remember the smell of his apron when I was a small child. It smelled like bacon grease and stale cigarettes. When the local factories closed, the diner bled money. The bank foreclosed on the restaurant, and a month later, they came for my grandfather's house. Patricia was a teenager when she watched men in cheap suits carry her family furniture out onto the front lawn. That eviction formed the bedrock of her personality. She clawed her way into an upper-middle-class zip code through a calculated marriage and relentless social climbing. She is psychologically terrified of poverty. To her, my food truck was not a culinary venture. It was the ghost of her father's failed diner rising from the grave to drag her back to the working class. She looked at my chef coat and saw her own childhood trauma. But her unresolved history was not an excuse to strangle my future. Understanding someone's wound does not mean you have to let them bleed all over your life. I looked at her finger resting against my binder. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't try to convince her that my profit margins were viable. I picked up the portfolio and stood up from the velvet booth. I left a $5 bill on the table for my coffee and walked out into the humid afternoon. I didn't drive back to my apartment. I drove my reliable Honda SUV directly to a used car dealership on the south side of town. The dealer walked around my car, kicking the tires and checking the odometer. He offered me $11,000 cash. I signed the title over on the hood of his truck. I walked out of that lot carrying a heavy envelope of $100 bills. I took a rideshare straight to the restaurant supply warehouse. I bought the diesel generator that same afternoon, paying the warehouse manager in cash. I watched his crew load the heavy, gleaming machine into the back of my now generator-less Honda. 2 weeks later, my food truck, the Southern Spoon, opened for business. The first few months were brutal. I worked 16-hour days, 7 days a week. The Alabama summer heat inside the truck was suffocating, the humidity relentless. My hands were perpetually stained with turmeric and cayenne, my back a constant ache. My initial customers were mostly the mechanics from the lot next door, construction workers and nurses from the nearby hospital. They were my chosen family, the ones who saw the fire in my eyes and didn't try to extinguish it. They were the ones who stood in the freezing rain, waiting for my food. One freezing October afternoon, during a particularly heavy downpour, a quiet, exhausted man in a rumpled tan trench coat ordered a pulled pork sandwich with my peach bourbon reduction. He didn't say much, just ate his food slowly under the awning. As he was leaving, I noticed him shivering. On an impulse, I handed him a warm sweet potato biscuit infused with sage and honey butter, an item not on my menu, just something I'd baked for myself. He thanked me with a small, genuine smile and disappeared into the rain. I thought nothing more of it. Then, one December morning, just after 5 a.m., I was jolted awake by a continuous, sustained buzzing. My phone vibrated with such force it slid across the polished wood and dropped onto the hardwood floor. I rolled over in the dark and reached down. The screen was blindingly bright. A cascade of alerts scrolled rapidly across the glass. Social media tags, unread emails from local news stations, a dozen text messages from regular customers. I tapped the topmost notification. It opened a web browser redirecting me to the digital front page of a premier national culinary publication. The headline was printed in bold black typography. The best Southern food in America is served from a parking lot in Birmingham. Beneath the title was a high-resolution photograph of my step van, capturing its worn aluminum siding, the glowing serving window, and the backdrop of the faded brick building. The author byline listed a name that commanded instant respect across the entire restaurant industry: Jonathan Hayes. He was a nationally syndicated food critic known for destroying million-dollar tasting menus and elevating unknown cooks into immediate stardom. He was also the quiet, exhausted man in the rumpled tan trench coat who had visited my lot during the freezing October rain. I sat up, pulling the quilt around my shoulders. I read the article. Hayes didn't write about velvet dining chairs or curated wine pairings. He wrote about the raw, unfiltered soul of the food. He described the biting cold of the rain and the warmth emanating from the metal truck. He devoted an entire paragraph to the peach bourbon reduction, writing the name exactly as I had chalked it on the board: the self-made glaze. He detailed the precise crunch of the fried chicken and the dark rendered bark of the smoked brisket. But the focal point of his review rested at the very end of the piece. He described sitting in his dark sedan, opening a small wax paper bag. He wrote about the sweet potato biscuit infused with sage and honey butter. He noted that the item was not on the menu. He explained that the chef handed it to him for free, simply to offer comfort on a miserable afternoon. He called the gesture a rare masterclass in culinary empathy. I set the phone on my lap. The screen cast a pale glow across the room. A strange quiet settled in my chest. The grueling labor, the bus rides holding sacks of flour, the sting of my mother denying the trust fund, the arrogant dismissal by my brother on the burning highway, all of it crystallized into this single published validation. I dressed quickly. I drove to the commissary kitchen and loaded every single piece of inventory I possessed into the step van. I prepped enough food to last me through Friday. I wanted to be prepared for a slight bump in midday traffic. I underestimated the power of the national press. I turned the corner onto the street bordering the mechanic lot just before 9. In the morning, I had to press hard on the brakes. A line of people stretched down the sidewalk. It wrapped around the corner and extended past the glass facades of the corporate bank towers. There were hundreds of people standing in the December chill. Marcus, the mechanic, stood near the entrance of his garage, wearing a heavy canvas jacket. He was directing vehicle traffic and gesturing for me to pull into my designated space. He caught my eye through the windshield and shook his head, smiling. I backed the van into position beneath the historic brick wall. The moment I cut the engine, a cheer erupted from the crowd. I scrambled into the rear compartment. I fired the generators. I dropped the baskets into the peanut oil and threw slabs of butter onto the flat-top grill. I opened the serving window at exactly 10:00. The next 3 hours became a blur of intense physical labor. My hands moved strictly on muscle memory. I sliced the sourdough. I plated the brisket. I poured the amber reduction over the fried chicken. The heat inside the van spiked, pushing the winter chill out through the exhaust vents. The ticket printer spat out orders in a continuous white ribbon. I didn't stop to drink water. I didn't stop to stretch my aching back. At 1:00 in the afternoon, I reached into the clear plastic Lexan bin. My fingers scraped the bare plastic bottom. I checked the secondary refrigerator. The shelves were empty. I walked to the serving window. I looked out at the remaining dozen people in line. I apologized and informed them I was entirely sold out. I pulled the heavy metal shutter down and locked it. I leaned against the stainless steel prep counter and slid down until I was sitting on the rubber floor mat. I rested my head against the cool metal door of the refrigerator. I had just sold a 4-day inventory supply in 180 minutes. My apron was coated in flour and grease. My muscles trembled from the sustained exertion. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone to check the time. A new message sat on the lock screen. It was an alert from the family group thread. I tapped the icon and opened the conversation. The text was from Patricia. "Hannah, I saw the article," she wrote. Her phrasing carried a frantic, breathless energy. Helen Montgomery forwarded the link to the country club mailing list. "Why did you not tell us a famous critic was visiting? We could have dressed the place up. We could have hired a photographer. I stared at the glowing text. I read the sentence 3 times. We could have dressed the place up. She wanted to put a decorative bow on a greasy engine block. She wanted to drape silk over the cracked concrete of the mechanic lot. She read a national review praising the grit, the resilience, and the unpolished authenticity of my cooking, and her only instinct was to sanitize it. The James Beard Foundation called me 3 months later. I was nominated for Best Chef. South. The gala was in Chicago. My mother and brother arrived in a private jet, courtesy of Preston's law firm. They were beaming, eager to be seen with me, their prodigal daughter, the one who had finally made it. I accepted the award, thanked my customers, and spoke about the dignity of honest labor. I did not mention my family. The true architecture of a family is not built on blood, but on trust, transparency, and the willingness to stand in the rain with your child, regardless of who might be watching from the dry comfort of a French bistro. My mother, Patricia, allowed her own childhood trauma, the ghost of her father's bankrupt diner, to dictate her parenting. Instead of looking at my calloused hands and seeing the fierce, commendable work ethic of a determined woman, she saw a threat to her carefully curated country club persona. When a parent lacks the emotional intelligence to separate their own past fears from their child's present ambitions, guidance curdles into sabotage. True family responsibility dictates that a parent must act as a steady lighthouse, illuminating the safest path through the storm. Patricia chose to turn off the light, hoping the dark would force her daughter to turn back toward a safer, more prestigious shore. She held the trust fund hostage, violating the core principle of fairness, simply because my dream required a grease-stained apron rather than a tailored blazer. This environment of conditional love inevitably poisons the sibling dynamic. Children are exceptionally observant. They map the boundaries of their parents' affection and adjust their survival strategies accordingly. Preston and Caroline watched their mother withhold love and capital based on zip codes and career titles. As a result, they did not view me as a sister to protect. They viewed me as a liability to manage and later as an asset to exploit. Preston's attempt to execute a hostile corporate takeover of my own trademark was the direct consequence of a household that valued leverage over loyalty. When fairness is removed from the family equation, siblings cease to be a team. They become competitors in a ruthless, silent auction for parental approval. Guiding a child through the American landscape requires more than just pushing them toward a high-paying degree or securing a spot at a prestigious firm. It requires instilling a deep, unwavering respect for honest labor. There is profound dignity in waking up before dawn, sourcing ingredients, feeding a community, and building a tangible product with your own 2 hands. I carried the true traditional values of my lineage, the resilience, the hospitality, the quiet strength of the working class. My family, blinded by the sterile allure of wealth, discarded those values, mistaking the veneer of success for the foundation of character. Because my biological family abandoned their responsibilities, I had to construct a chosen family. I found the virtues of honesty, protection, and fairness not in a sprawling colonial home in Mountain Brook, but on a cracked concrete lot. I found a father figure in Marcus, the mechanic who hauled my broken step van off the highway and refused to charge me for the tow. I found brothers and sisters in the construction workers and nurses who stood in the freezing rain to eat my food. These individuals understood the unspoken social contract of community. They recognized my fire, and instead of trying to extinguish it, they gathered around to keep it burning. We share these narratives on the Aura Vengeance channel because the dynamics of toxic hierarchies and quiet retribution resonate across every demographic. If you find value in dissecting the complex hidden layers of family psychology and the quiet power of standing your ground, we invite you to subscribe and join our community. We explore the profound truth that you do not need to raise your voice to win the argument. You simply need to build a structure they cannot tear down. When we reflect on me sitting in the empty dining room of the historic brick building I just purchased, acting as the legal landlord to the brother who tried to destroy me, we are left to examine our own foundations. Parenting is a long-term investment, but the currency is not financial. The currency is trust, transparency, and the willingness to stand in the rain with your child, regardless of who might be watching from the dry comfort of a French bistro. Look closely at the people sitting around your own dinner table. Observe the unspoken rules governing the affection you give and receive. Are the bonds forged in genuine respect, or are they tied to the titles on a business card? If the engine of your life suddenly started smoking on the side of a brutal highway, who would actually drive out to pull you from the wreckage? And who would simply accelerate in the passing lane? The answers to those questions define the true architecture of a family. Sometimes the people who share your blood are merely an audience waiting to see if your performance meets their standards. And sometimes the only way to find out who truly belongs in your life is to let the illusion shatter, sweep up the glass, and see who stays behind to help you rebuild.